Hey everyone! So today we are diving deep into one of the most famous and maybe infamous military ideas of our time, shock and awe. We're going to break down its story, its incredible seeming success, and the really dangerous legacy it left behind, all based on a fascinating lecture by Professor Jiang. Let's get right into it.
I know. That sounds like a pretty dark joke, right? But according to Professor Shang, this quote is actually the secret key to understanding a massive, and I mean massive, shift in American foreign policy. It's a puzzle, for sure, but stick with me because by the end of this, we're going to solve it together. All right, so let's set the scene. The year is 2003, and the U.S. is invading Iraq. And the whole thing is over in just 3 weeks. 3! It was a victory so fast, so decisive it looked perfect, like it completely rewrote the rules of war. But the real question is, how on earth did they pull that off? I mean, just look at these numbers for a second. The US-led coalition was outnumbered almost 3-1. By any normal military math, this should have been a long, bloody disaster. But instead, they didn't just win, they completely steamrolled the opposition.
So, what was the secret? Well, the official answer was this revolutionary new doctrine, shock and awe. The theory was actually kind of simple, but incredibly bold. The idea is, you don't fight the enemy's body. You go straight for their mind. You use your technology to create this feeling of being a god, of being everywhere at once, and you paralyze your enemy with pure terror.
And you can see here just how radical this was. On the left, you've got the old-school Pentagon playbook. Bring in massive armies, be careful with your supply lines, textbook stuff. But on the right, you've got this wild new idea pushed by the civilian leadership, a smaller, lightning-fast force that relies entirely on air power, total surveillance, and elite special forces. It was a massive, massive gamble.
And wow, did that gamble seem to pay off. The war was over in what felt like a blink of an eye. U.S. casualties were shockingly low, especially when you compare them to the tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers lost. You had these moments called thunder runs, where American tanks would just drive laps around Baghdad, not to conquer it, just to show that they could. It felt like proof that the theory was absolutely perfect. So to the rest of the world, this looked like the future. This was the new way to fight wars. But this is where Professor Jiang steps in and says, hold on a second. He argues that what we saw wasn't a revolution at all. It was a one-time miracle, a perfect storm of unique conditions that could probably never happen again. According to Professor Jiang, there were 3 secret ingredients. First, Saddam Hussein had basically zero air defense. Why? He just didn't believe the US would actually go all the way and topple his regime. Second, the Iraqi desert was the perfect playground for this kind of war. It's flat, wide open, basically a dream for satellites and bombers. And third, it was a total surprise. Nobody in history had ever tried to fight a war like this, so nobody knew how to defend against it. And, you can only pull off a trick like that once. So that begs the question, right? If this whole doctrine was so specific to that one situation, why did they even create it? Why take such a huge risk on this untested theory? Well, to answer that, Professor Jiang says we have to go back in time. We have to look at the deep institutional wound that shaped the modern American military, the Vietnam War. For the American psyche, Vietnam was an absolute trauma. It was this long, brutal, messy, and incredibly expensive war. I mean, at its peak, there were 500,000 U.S. troops on the ground. It just dragged on and on, cost 58,000 American lives, and it all ended in this humiliating withdrawal. This experience left a permanent scar on the military establishment. And then, things got even worse. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, and they revealed some absolutely devastating truths. The government had been lying for years about expanding the war. The leaders knew it was probably unwinnable, and the only real goal was just to avoid the embarrassment of losing. You can imagine what that did to public trust. It was just shattered.
And here's the most critical part of this whole story. According to Professor Jiang, the lesson the Pentagon took away from Vietnam wasn't really about military tactics. The lesson was that its biggest enemy wasn't in another country, it was the American public right here at home. They saw protests, a critical media, and democratic debate as things that tied their hands. So, to keep its power, the empire needed a way to fight wars without asking for permission and without the public even really paying attention. Okay, so this is where shock and awe stops being just a military tactic and becomes something much bigger. It's actually a whole theory of empire. It represents this really profound shift in how America saw itself in the world. And Professor Jiang explains this using a really powerful story.
Just look at the difference here between two different American empires. In 1991, during the First Gulf War, the whole approach was based on restraint. The goals were limited, they built a huge coalition of countries, they got UN approval, it was all about humility. Fast forward to 2003, and it's the total opposite. The goals are vague and unlimited, they act alone, and the attitude is pure arrogance. It's we make our own rules. So what changed so dramatically?
Well, to explain it, Professor Jiang tells this story. Picture a dying billionaire. He built this massive empire through discipline, hard work, and being smart. On his deathbed, he calls his son in for one final request. He makes his son promise just one thing. After I'm gone, you have to listen to my experienced advisors, the ones who helped me build all of this. The son promises. The father dies. The son inherits everything, all the money, all the power. So what do you think is the very first thing he does? He fires every single one of them. He gets rid of all the experience, all the restraint, all the wisdom. And when asked why, his answer is simple, because it's fun. And that brings us right back to that quote from the very beginning. What's the point of having all this power if you can't just use it for fun? According to Professor Jiang, that was the exact mindset driving the invasion in 2003. But this shift, from the careful, responsible father to the reckless, arrogant son, it comes with a very heavy price. This new shock and awe mindset created a whole set of dangerous, systemic problems. Professor Jiang calls this the hubris trap, and it has three critical flaws. First, overcommitment. It's this belief that your technology makes you a god, that you can be everywhere and do everything all at once. Second, there's no real strategic focus. There's no long-term plan besides just holding on to power. And finally, you've just got pure hubris, this blinding arrogance where you refuse to even consider the possibility that you could lose. And this chart really just puts that problem in stark numbers. The US is trying to police a global empire with a fraction of the tools it once had. Look at this. The US Navy had over 7,000 ships at the end of World War II. Today, it's under 500. Yet the mission is still to police the entire globe. It's a textbook example of imperial overstretch, and it's fueled by this arrogant belief that technology can magically solve everything. And that brings us to our final and pretty heavy question. By creating a doctrine like shock and awe, a doctrine specifically designed to forget the painful lessons of Vietnam, a doctrine that tries to separate war from democracy and consequences, has the American military just set itself up to repeat the very same mistakes of hubris and overreach it tried so desperately to leave behind? It's a sobering thought for sure.